Australians are all too familiar with some of those terrible images from the barbaric reign of Islamic State in parts of Iraq and Syria. What's not as widely known is the critical role Australian troops played in some of the key battles there, including at Mosul, where Islamic State had overrun the city in 2014 and gained control of a massive amount of American military hardware that was critical to Islamic State's power in subsequent years. Iraqi troops retook the city in 2017, but there were some Australians on the ground there in Mosul during that battle too. Their story is told in a new book out this month. Author Ben McKelvey joins us now from Sydney. Ben, g'day. So when did you realise there was a book in this and it was a story that was needed to be told?
Morning, Joe. I had the idea in 2016, 2017 when I was working with Australian Special Operations Command on another book called The Commando, which was about Cameron Baird, a soldier who was killed in Afghanistan and was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross. I'd heard that Australians had gone over to Iraq to fight against Islamic State in something called Operation Okra. But the public-facing information was that they were just in an advisory role. And in a training role. And it wasn't until last year when one of the operators came and contacted me and told me this incredible story about Phase Zero operations that the Australian Special Forces were involved in, which is inserting into the country in an area where Islamic State was in predominant control. And then also he was involved in the Battle of Mosul, and the Australians who were involved there were involved in a significant way.
Yeah. And so at the heart of this book of yours is this obvious deep respect for the soldiers who spoke to you. Tell us about how strong a soldier Ian Turner was and the role the Australians played in Mosul.
So Ian Turner was a commando team leader who did two tours of Iraq as a private military contractor, and then did a number of tours in Afghanistan, and then two tours as part of Operation Okra. He was an incredible soldier. He was someone who was very calm in battle. He was someone who was very tactically minded. He was someone who was dedicated to his training. And a number of soldiers sort of describe how calm he was when he was in a gunfight. But the interesting aspect of Ian's story is also when he came home. Ian's someone who suffered quite badly from post-traumatic stress disorder. And he was someone that contacted me while he was in a psychiatric hospital. And his story sadly ended in 2017 when he took his own life. And that was one of the catalysts to write this book, because I wanted to tell Ian's story, and I wanted to tell a sort of a personal and complete story about post-traumatic stress disorder and what it was like to be an Australian Special Forces soldier in Afghanistan and in Iraq.
Your book also tells the stories of the Australians who ended up fighting with Islamic State. Why was it important that be incorporated in this story too?
There were a couple of reasons for me. Personally, I thought it was interesting and I thought it was sort of essential because I had written a book about Afghanistan and yet I hadn't had much access to the enemy. I didn't have access to them physically, and I also didn't really have much access to them emotionally either. I couldn't quite understand what the people who were fighting the Australians were all about. With the Australians who fought for Islamic State, it was people who had grown up in Sydney. You know, it was people, in one instance, it was a man that I'd met when I was working in King's Cross, when I was living in King's Cross, and he was working at a strip club.
That was Khalid Sharif?
No, that was Muhammad Ali Barry.
Right. Tell us a bit about Khalid Sharif.
Well, Sharif is Australia's most notorious jihadi, and his story is detailed in the book all the way back to Operation Pandanus, which was a terrorist plot to commit mass atrocities in Sydney and Melbourne that Sharif was a part of. One of the sort of elemental parts of Sharif's story is his story of his degenerating mental health. He was a man that was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and he ended up being part of a criminal milieu. He was part of a sectarian gang here in Sydney, and then became a bit of a big note within Islamic State when he went to Syria and Iraq.
Yeah. And so, as you mentioned, tragically, one of the key figures in your book, Ian Turner, died by suicide in 2017. How much of a rapport had you built up with him, and how tough was that for you personally?
I built up a little bit of a rapport with him. So I only met him a couple of times personally, and then we spoke online a little bit. But the catalyst for me writing his story was after The Commando had been published, his wife contacted me, and she wanted to talk about the conversations that I'd had with him. And then we continued our conversations. And the reason why she was so compelling also was because she is actually a counselor at Special Operations Command. So she has a background as a psychologist. So I think probably the story to take away from that is that, you know, he was getting help and he was being monitored, but sometimes post-traumatic stress disorder will just take over.
Yeah, and so what conclusions did you come to about how the Australian military cares for the soldiers it creates after those soldiers are confronted with the grotesque horrors that they witness and end up with PTSD like Ian Turner?
Well, I think that the care is there, but sometimes the care might not even be enough. The other issue is that it's very much an opt-in thing, as it has to be. The soldiers have to put their hand up and they say, you know, like I'm having these mental health issues, which is something that, especially within Special Operations Command, people are very reluctant to do. You'll still be considered a linger if you're someone who's not doing the work that everybody else is doing because you're having mental health issues. And if you are having mental health issues, there are instances of people being taken off active duty and not having access to weapons and to the range and things like that. So there were very few people who I spoke to while they were active that they would put their hand up and say, I'm having these PTSD issues, despite the fact that a lot of the guys I spoke to in that book and in The Commando had certainly exhibited symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, substance issues, alcohol issues, problem sleeping, and alarmingly, a number of people confided to me that they had wished that they had gone out the way that Cameron Baird had gone out, which was killed in combat.
Yeah, so still big challenges for Defence in dealing with that. And what's the mood among the Special Forces soldiers that you know ahead of this major report due out soon investigating allegations of war crimes by Australians in Afghanistan?
I mean, obviously it's something that's really concerning for the guys, not only because it's the sort of Damocles hanging over them because they don't necessarily know whether they're going to be caught up in this investigation or not. But I think one of the primary concerns is that when and if the report does come out, it's been a long time coming, is whether the context is going to be understood in which these 55 sort of alleged transgressions happen. I don't think that the Afghan war is particularly well understood by the Australian public and by the Australian media to a certain extent because journalists were not given much access to the Australian Special Forces while they were operating in Afghanistan. If there were 55 battlefield murders that were transgressive, this is in the context of 8,000 to 12,000 Afghans that were killed by the Australian Special Forces legally. So I don't think the soldiers think that anyone should be forgiven for doing something horrible like executing a prisoner, but I think that that the kill culture that had developed in Afghanistan has to be explored and has to be understood. And that kill culture couldn't have developed without the higher-ups having an understanding of that happening and perhaps promoting that. And the question of whether there was any civilian oversight as to what the Special Forces were doing in Afghanistan is one that still hangs, Once you start talking to these guys, you sort of have a recognition of what was expected of them and what the culture was in Afghanistan. And I just wonder whether the people who should have done that at a high level were doing that.
Yeah, well, that's that we're hearing that report is likely to come out in the next couple of months. And your book, Ben, comes out the end of this month.
Yep, it comes out in a couple of weeks.
Okay, thanks for talking to us this morning, Ben McKelvey there.
Thanks, Joe.